The pale moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the rugged terrain of Gyeongsang province. Li Jin, a young scholar barely 20 years of age, trudged along the winding mountain path, his worn straw sandals whispering against the dusty earth. His stomach grumbled, a stark reminder of his dwindling provisions. The capital, with its promise of the imperial examination, felt a world away. He was but a poor scholar, the son of a humble farmer, clutching on to the hope of a better future through scholarly success. As dusk deepened, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fading orange, Jean spotted a faint flicker of light in the distance. It was a small, thatched roof house nestled amongst the trees, a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. Relief washed over him, the prospect of shelter, however meager, was a welcome one. He approached the house, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "Is anyone home?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, her face etched with the lines of time and hardship. This was Ba Choi, a woman hardened by the harsh realities of rural life. Behind her, a younger woman emerged, her beauty striking even in the dim light. This was Seowa, Ba Choi's daughter-in-law, a widow whose sorrow clung to her like a shroud. "I am a traveling scholar," Jean explained, bowing low. "I seek shelter for the night, if you would be so kind." Ba Choi scrutinized him with a wary eye. "We are but poor folk," she said, her voice raspy. "But we will not turn away a traveler in need. Come in." Inside, the house was sparsely furnished, but clean. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the mud walls. Seowa moved with a quiet grace, her every movement a testament to her innate elegance. Jean found himself captivated by her beauty, a feeling that both thrilled and troubled him. He was a scholar, bound by Confucian ideals, and she was a widow, a woman who, according to the rigid social norms of Joseon, was expected to remain eternally devoted to her deceased husband. As they ate a simple meal of rice and pickled vegetables, Ba Choi announced that she had to visit a neighboring village on urgent business. She would be gone for the night, leaving Seowa alone in the house. A flicker of unease crossed Jin's face, but he quickly masked it, assuring Ba Choi that he would behave with utmost propriety. He knew, however, that the night ahead would be a test of his resolve. After Ba Choi departed, an awkward silence filled the small house. Seowa busied herself with household chores, her movements deliberate and restrained. Jean, seated by the fire, pretended to read a scroll. But his eyes kept straying towards her. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft rustle of her hanbok, of the delicate curve of her neck. He tried to focus on his studies, on the upcoming examination, on the future he so desperately craved. But his thoughts kept returning to Seowa, to the unspoken sadness in her eyes, to the undeniable attraction that simmered between them. He knew it was wrong, forbidden even, but he couldn't help but feel a stirring of desire, a yearning for something more than the solitary life of a scholar. He was young, after all, and the proximity of such beauty was a potent temptation. The night deepened, and the silence grew heavier, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional sigh from Seowa. Jean found himself unable to sleep, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He was torn between his scholarly aspirations, his Confucian upbringing, and the undeniable pull of his physical desires. He was a man on the precipice, teetering between virtue and temptation. The air crackled with unspoken tension. He glanced at Seowa, who was now seated near the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. Her profile was exquisite, her skin luminous in the soft light. He imagined reaching out to her, touching her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He knew he should resist, that any advance would be a grave transgression, but the desire was almost overwhelming. He was a moth drawn to a flame, a scholar seduced by beauty. He knew the consequences of his actions could be dire. He shifted uncomfortably, attempting to find relief. Siawa, sensing his gaze, turned to face him. Her eyes, dark and deep, held a mixture of sadness and wariness. "Are you unable to sleep, scholar?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Jean stammered, caught off guard. I am troubled by my studies," he lied, avoiding her gaze. Siawa didn't reply immediately. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Jean felt his cheeks flush with shame. He knew she saw through his lie, that she sensed the true nature of his turmoil. Finally, Siawa spoke, her voice low and measured. "Scholar," she said, "you are a guest in this house. You are under my protection. Do not dishonor yourself. Or me, with improper thoughts." Her words were like a splash of cold water, jolting him back to reality. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had allowed his desires to cloud his judgment, to disrespect the sanctity of her home and her widowhood. He had forgotten the teachings of Confucius, the importance of propriety and self-control. I apologize, Noang Tu," he stammered, bowing his head. "I meant no disrespect." Siawa's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Leave this room, scholar," she commanded. "Sleep outside. The night air will cool your head." Jean, humbled and ashamed, obeyed without question. He gathered his meager belongings and stepped out into the cold night air. He deserved this punishment, he knew. He had allowed himself to be tempted, to stray from the path of righteousness. He lay down on the cold, hard ground, the starry sky his only witness. He spent the rest of the night wrestling with his conscience, vowing to regain control of his thoughts and actions. He had learned a valuable, albeit painful, lesson. The night was a harsh teacher, but its lesson was clear: virtue was a fortress that must be constantly guarded against the siege of temptation. The next morning, Ba Choi returned, her face etched with concern. She had heard from a neighbor that Jean had slept outside. "Why did you sleep outside, scholar?" she asked. Her voice sharp with suspicion. "Did my daughter-in-law mistreat you?" Siawa remained silent, her expression impassive. Jean, however, felt compelled to speak the truth, even if it meant admitting his own transgression. "It was my fault, Lao Ba," he confessed, bowing low. I had improper thoughts. Siawa Noang Tu was right to send me out." Ba Choi looked from Jean to Siawa, her brow furrowed. She was a woman of strict principles, deeply rooted in the Confucian traditions of Joseon. She valued honor and propriety above all else. But she also cared for her daughter-in-law, and she recognized the inherent vulnerability of a young widow. "Siawa," she said, her voice softening slightly, "you should have been more patient with our guest. He is a scholar, a man of learning. You should have shown him more respect." Jean was taken aback. He had expected Ba Choi to reprimand him, not Siawa. He felt a surge of guilt and shame. He had not only disrespected Siawa, but he had also caused her to be scolded by her mother-in-law. "Lao Ba," he said, "please do not blame Siawa Noang Tu. She did nothing wrong. It was I who acted improperly. I deserved her rebuke." But Choi ignored him, continuing to address Siawa. "A woman must be gentle and accommodating, even when faced with impropriety," she lectured. "You must learn to control your temper, to be more patient and understanding." Siawa remained silent, her head bowed. Jean felt a deep sense of injustice. Siawa had acted with courage and integrity, while he had behaved like a fool. Yet, she was the one being punished. It was a stark reminder of the unequal status of women in Joseon society. Jean, unable to bear the situation any longer, decided to leave. He thanked Ba Choi for her hospitality, apologized again for his behavior, and quickly departed. He walked away with a heavy heart, carrying the burden of his shame and the weight of the injustice he had witnessed. The experience had left a deep impression on him, a wound that would take time to heal. He had learned a valuable lesson about self-control, about respect for women, and about the harsh realities of the world he lived in. He continued his journey, the image of Seowa's sad, beautiful face etched in his memory. He knew he would never forget her, or the lesson he had learned that night. He vowed to become a better man, a man worthy of respect, a man who would uphold the principles of justice and righteousness. The road ahead was long and arduous, but he was determined to walk it with integrity and honor. He had stumbled, but he would not fall. He would rise, stronger and wiser, from the ashes of his mistakes. He would become the man he was meant to be, the scholar he aspired to be. 7795, 15742. He eventually arrived at another small village. Nestled by the sea, a collection of humble homes clinging to the coastline. The air was thick with the scent of salt and fish, and the cries of gulls filled the air. He sought lodging once more, this time at the house of a fisherman named Byung-ho. Byung-ho's house, though larger than Bachoy, was still humble, reflecting the simple, hardscrabble life of the villagers. Byung-ho, a burly man with a weathered face and calloused hands, welcomed him with gruff hospitality. He introduced Jean to his wife, Miran, a woman whose beauty was as striking as it was unsettling. She was younger than Byung-ho, with a voluptuous figure and a bold, provocative gaze. Her eyes lingered on Jean, a spark of something dangerous flickering within them. As they shared a meal of grilled fish and rice, Byung-ho announced that he had to go out to sea for the night. He would be back in the morning, he said, leaving Jean alone with Miran. A wave of unease washed over Jean. The situation was eerily similar to the one he had faced at Bachoy's house. But this time, the woman was far more forward, far more suggestive. He felt a sense of foreboding, a premonition of danger. After Byung-ho left, Miran wasted no time in making her intentions known. She moved closer to Jean, her body brushing against his. She spoke in a low, seductive voice, her words laced with innuendo. She offered him wine, her hand lingering on his as she poured it. "You are a handsome scholar," she purred, her eyes raking over him. "It must be lonely, traveling all alone." Jean felt a surge of desire, but this time, it was tempered by caution and the memory of his previous transgression. He knew he was walking a dangerous path. That he was being tempted once again. But this time, he was determined to resist. "I am grateful for your hospitality, Noang too," he said, his voice firm. "But I am a man of honor. I will not betray your husband's trust." Miran laughed, a throaty, provocative sound. "My husband is a fool," she said, her eyes flashing. "He cares more for his fish than he does for me. He leaves me alone, night after night. Do you think I should remain faithful to such a man?" She moved closer, her body pressing against his. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You are different, scholar," she whispered. "You are a man of passion. I can see it in your eyes." Jean felt his resolve weakening. Her touch was intoxicating, her words seductive. He was a young man, full of blood and desire. He was a virgin still, and a desirable woman was throwing herself at his feet. He was tempted, sorely tempted, to succumb to her advances. But the image of Seowa's face, her sad, reproachful eyes, flashed before his mind. He remembered the shame he had felt, the injustice he had witnessed. He could not repeat his mistake. He gently pushed Miran away. "Please, Noang too," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Do not tempt me. I will not betray my principles." Miran's eyes narrowed. She was not accustomed to being rejected. "Are you afraid, scholar?" she taunted. "Or are you simply not man enough?" Her words stung, but Jean stood his ground. "I am not afraid," he said. "But I am a man of honor. I will not dishonor myself, or you, by succumbing to temptation. He was drawing strength not from the teachings of Confucius this time, but from the image of the wronged widow. Miran, seeing that her seduction was failing, resorted to more drastic measures. She slipped a powder into his wine, a potent sleeping draught. Jean, unsuspecting, drank the wine. Within minutes, he felt his senses fading, his body growing heavy. He collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. He had been betrayed, not by his own weakness, but by the treachery of another. Miran, satisfied that Jean was incapacitated, sent for her lover, Gyeongsang, the wealthy merchant. Gyeongsang, a man of low morals and insatiable appetites, arrived quickly, eager to take advantage of the situation. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator disguised as a benefactor. Miran and Gyeongsang, consumed by lust and oblivious to the impending danger, engaged in a passionate embrace, their bodies entwined on the floor next to the unconscious Jean. Their moans and gasps filled the small room, a symphony of forbidden desire. They were lost in their own world, unaware of the eyes that watched them from the shadows. Byung-ho, having grown suspicious of his wife's fidelity, had not gone out to sea. Instead, he had hidden nearby, watching the house, waiting for proof of her infidelity. He had enlisted the help of Gyeongsang, believing him to be a trustworthy friend, to keep an eye on Miran. He had not expected Gyeongsang to be the very man betraying him. He was a hunter, skilled in tracking animals, but he had been blind to the treachery of his own wife and his supposed friend. As he witnessed the scene unfolding before him, a rage consumed him, a primal fury that blotted out all reason. He was a man betrayed, his honor shattered, his heart broken. He burst into the room. His eyes blazing with fury, a hunting knife clutched in his hand. "You treacherous whore," he roared, his voice thick with rage and pain. "And you, Gyeongsang, you snake. I trusted you." Miran and Gyeongsang, startled and terrified, scrambled to their feet, their nakedness exposed in the flickering lamplight. They were caught. Trapped in their web of lies and deceit. They were like animals cornered by a hunter, their fate sealed. Byung-ho lunged at Gyeongsang, the knife flashing in the dim light. The blade found its mark, sinking deep into Gyeongsang's chest. A strangled cry escaped Gyeongsang's lips as he crumpled to the floor, blood gushing from the wound. He was dead within seconds, his life extinguished by the very man he had betrayed. Miran screamed, a piercing shriek of terror and despair. She tried to flee, but Byung-ho grabbed her by the hair, dragging her back. He was a man possessed, driven by a blind fury that demanded vengeance. "You will pay for your sins, whore," he hissed. His face contorted with rage. He raised the knife again, the blade glinting menacingly. Miran pleaded for her life, tears streaming down her face, but Byung-ho was deaf to her pleas. He was beyond reason, beyond mercy. He plunged the knife into her heart, ending her life with a single, brutal blow. The room fell silent. Save for the ragged breathing of Byung-ho and the gurgling sound of blood pooling on the floor. The scene was horrific, a tableau of violence and death. 2 lives had been extinguished, victims of lust, betrayal, and a husband's uncontrollable rage. The air was thick with the stench of blood and the weight of tragedy. Byung-ho stood there. Trembling, the bloody knife still clutched in his hand. He looked at the lifeless bodies of his wife and his former friend, his rage slowly giving way to a profound sense of emptiness and despair. He had taken his revenge, but it had brought him no solace. He had destroyed his own life, along with the lives of 2 others. He looked at Jean, still unconscious on the floor. He had initially believed Jean to be another one of his wife's lovers, another participant in his humiliation. But he now realized that Jean was innocent, a victim of Miran's treachery, just as he was. He felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of remorse. He knelt down beside Jean, checking for signs of life. He found a faint pulse, a shallow breath. Jean was alive, but barely. Byung-ho knew he had to do something, to atone in some small way for the carnage he had wrought. He had to save the life of this innocent scholar. He had to try and bring a little bit of light, into so much overwhelming dark. The guilt weighed heavily on him, like the mountainous landscape surrounding the village. He gently lifted Jin, carrying him outside into the cool night air. He splashed water on Jin's face, trying to revive him. Slowly, Jin began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around, confused and disoriented, his memory hazy. What happened?" he mumbled, his voice weak. Byung-ho hesitated, unsure of how to explain the horrific events that had transpired. He decided to tell Jin a partial truth, omitting his own role in the deaths. "Your drink was poisoned," he said, his voice strained. "You were attacked. I found you and fought off your attackers. They are dead." Jin struggled to sit up, his head throbbing. He saw the bloodstains on the floor, the overturned furniture, the signs of a violent struggle. He felt a wave of nausea and fear. He had narrowly escaped death, thanks to the intervention of this strange, troubled man. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved my life." Byung-ho looked away, unable to meet Jin's gaze. He was consumed by guilt and shame. He had saved Jin's life, but he had also taken 2 others. He was a murderer, a man stained with blood. He could never truly atone for his sins. He was a haunted man, doomed to live with the consequences of his actions. He told Lee Jin to flee, to disappear before authorities arrived. He advised him to continue with his exam, and to forget about all that had happened that night. Jin, still shaken and confused, obeyed. He gathered his belongings and fled the village, leaving behind the scene of horror and the man who had both saved and destroyed lives. He ran, as far and fast as his legs would carry him, until he collapsed, out of breath and overwhelmed with shock. He eventually made his way. He continued on his journey to the capital, the events of that night a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that lurked within the human heart. He had witnessed the destructive power of lust, betrayal, and revenge. He had seen the depths of human depravity, but he had also experienced a glimmer of hope, a spark of kindness in the midst of tragedy. He successfully passed the imperial examination, achieving his long-sought goal. He became a renowned scholar and a respected official, known for his wisdom, integrity, and compassion. He never forgot the lessons he had learned, the painful experiences that had shaped him. He used his position to promote justice and to help those in need, especially women who had suffered from the injustices of society. He remembered Seowa, the virtuous widow who had taught him the importance of self-control, and Miran, the treacherous wife who had led him to the brink of disaster. He remembered Byung-ho, the man consumed by rage and guilt, who had ultimately saved his life. He lived a long and fulfilling life, guided by the principles of righteousness and compassion. He had faced temptation and overcome it. He had witnessed tragedy and learned from it. He had become the man he was meant to be, a man of honor, a man of wisdom, a man who had found redemption in the ashes of a dark and tumultuous past. The events in the 2 houses were a constant reminder of the path not taken, the disaster avoided.